James Garner and Steve McQueen were two of Hollywood's most admired leading men, but their relationship was anything but simple. Garner, admired for his quiet strength and natural authenticity, once offered an assessment of McQueen that cut deeper than any review or headline. To Garner, the man celebrated as the king of cool carried within him a flaw that no amount of fame, money, or style could ever conceal. It wasn't just about how McQueen worked on screen. It was about who he was behind the scenes and how those choices shaped everything around him. In 1963, audiences were introduced to The Great Escape, one of the most ambitious war films of its era. Directed by John Sturges and based on the true story of Allied prisoners breaking out of a German camp, the movie carried a cast stacked with talent. Among them was James Garner as Flight Lieutenant Bob Hendley, the smooth-talking scrounger who could talk his way into or out of anything, and Steve McQueen as Captain Virgil Hiltz, the rebellious Cooler King who became the face of the film with his defiant motorcycle stunts. On screen, their chemistry looked seamless. Off-screen, the reality was more complicated. McQueen was already riding high from his role in The Magnificent Seven, but with success came a growing sense of entitlement. When he first read the script for The Great Escape, McQueen hated it. His role wasn't heroic enough in his eyes, and he made no effort to hide his frustrations. He loudly complained, threatened to quit, and brought production to the edge of crisis. Sturges, juggling the demands of a large ensemble, grew exasperated. He was ready to drop McQueen, but the studio couldn't imagine losing such a rising star. To appease McQueen, the script was reworked. Motorcycle stunts were added to his role, despite the fact that no such feats ever happened in the real escape story. That iconic moment of Hiltz jumping a barbed wire fence, etched forever in film history, was pure Hollywood invention designed to soothe an ego. Even then, McQueen failed to perform the jump during practice, forcing his stunt double Bud Ekins to step in. Garner, ever the professional, stayed focused on his role. He understood the job, delivered his performance, and kept the production moving. Years later, when reflecting on this experience, Garner didn't mince words. He described McQueen as a poser, a man more interested in cultivating an image than in truly acting. Garner admitted that McQueen had screen presence, but added, "You could always see him acting." That's the kiss of death. For Garner, who valued authenticity above all, McQueen's behavior revealed the deepest problem: his insecurity. The man millions admired for his effortless cool wasn't effortless at all. He was carefully manufacturing a persona, fighting for the spotlight, and never comfortable enough to simply be part of a team. The behavior James Garner witnessed on The Great Escape wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that followed Steve McQueen throughout his career. His desire to control how he was seen, both on screen and off, created tension wherever he went. Co-stars respected his talent, but often grew weary of his demands. One of the most telling examples came a decade later, on the set of The Towering Inferno in 1974. The film was a massive production, pairing McQueen with Paul Newman, another giant of Hollywood. On paper, it was a dream collaboration. Two icons sharing the screen in a disaster epic. In practice, it became a battle of egos. McQueen insisted that his name appear first in the credits. Newman, equally proud, refused to take second billing. The studio was forced into a compromise. McQueen's name appeared first horizontally, while Newman's was placed higher vertically. But that wasn't enough for McQueen. He went so far as to count the number of lines in the script, determined not to let Newman have more dialogue. When he discovered Newman had 12 lines more, McQueen erupted with fury. It wasn't about the story or the audience. It was about keeping score. This wasn't new for him. On The Magnificent Seven, McQueen had already developed a reputation for stealing scenes. While Yul Brynner delivered lines in the foreground, McQueen would fidget in the background, adjusting his hat, playing with his gun, shifting props. anything to draw the audience's eyes away from his co-star. Brenner, known for his commanding stage presence, found McQueen's antics infuriating. Garner saw all of this for what it was. To him, McQueen's need to dominate came not from strength, but from fear. It was insecurity dressed up as confidence. Garner drew a distinction that cut deep. Marlon Brando could be difficult, but Brando was a true actor, someone immersed in his craft. McQueen, Garner argued, was just a movie star, a man obsessed with the surface image, rather than the substance underneath. While fans adored McQueen's rebellious persona, Garner recognized the toll it took on those around him. Hollywood is full of egos, but McQueen's insecurity created friction that didn't need to exist. To Garner, that was the biggest problem. He couldn't simply let his work or his talent speak for itself. He always had to prove something, always had to control the perception, always had to fight for the spotlight. And in doing so, he alienated the very people who worked hardest to make him look good. If there was one figure who could ignite Steve McQueen's insecurities like no other, it was Paul Newman. The two men were rivals not only at the box office but also in Hollywood's social hierarchy. Newman, with his piercing blue eyes and natural charisma, had already secured his place as one of America's most beloved actors by the time McQueen was clawing his way up. To McQueen, Newman represented everything he wanted to be: respected, admired, and seemingly untouchable. Their rivalry erupted most famously during the making of The Towering Inferno in 1974, when both men were cast as leads. McQueen, ever obsessed with control and ego, demanded equal billing. The negotiations became a battleground over who would get top placement, how many lines each would deliver, and even the size of their trailers. Newman, known for his humility and professionalism, was baffled by McQueen's relentless need to compete. But for McQueen, the comparison was unbearable. He feared being overshadowed. James Garner observed these dynamics with disdain. To him, Newman embodied the professionalism and balance that McQueen lacked. Where Newman used his fame to fund charities, build race teams, and focus on his craft, McQueen was trapped in cycles of paranoia and self-destructive pride. Garner once remarked that McQueen seemed incapable of sharing the spotlight without feeling threatened. This wasn't just about billing on a poster. It was about McQueen's deep-seated insecurity, the gnawing belief that he was never truly enough. The rivalry extended beyond films. In Hollywood circles, Newman and McQueen were often measured against each other. Critics wrote comparisons, and fans debated who was the greater actor. McQueen, who should have been secure in his status as the king of cool, instead felt haunted by the thought that Newman's legacy would eclipse his own. Garner, ever the steady observer, recognized that this was McQueen's greatest weakness: his inability to celebrate the success of others without turning it into a personal war. By the mid-1970s, the contrast between McQueen's restless insecurity and Newman's quiet confidence only grew starker. For Garner, the tragedy was clear. Steve McQueen had the talent, the fame, and the opportunities, but his obsession with rivals ensured that he was never at peace. Steve McQueen's public image was one of effortless cool. He was the man every studio wanted, the rebel every director admired, and the heartthrob audiences adored. But beneath that polished exterior, McQueen was plagued by demons that James Garner could not ignore. Garner saw past the charm and style, recognizing the deep cracks in McQueen's personality that fame only widened. McQueen's childhood had left him scarred in ways that no amount of success could heal. Abandoned by his father, mistreated by stepfathers, and raised in an unstable home, he carried into adulthood a raw wound of rejection. That wound turned into mistrust, jealousy, and a need to dominate every room he entered. Colleagues often described him as suspicious of everyone's motives, constantly scanning for betrayal even among friends. Garner, who valued authenticity and camaraderie, found this exhausting and unnecessary. On set, McQueen's insecurities played out in destructive ways. He would insist on multiple takes not for artistic reasons, but to outshine a co-star. He was known to cut lines from scripts if he feared another actor might draw more attention. To Garner, this behavior was not just unprofessional, it was tragic. Here was a man with immense natural talent, yet he wasted it by waging battles against shadows of his own making. In his personal life, McQueen's struggles were just as stark. His marriages were turbulent, marked by infidelity, jealousy, and control. Friends recalled how his temper could erupt without warning, a reflection of his inner chaos. Drugs and paranoia further eroded his sense of stability. Garner, who enjoyed a long and steady marriage to Lois Clark, couldn't have been more different. Where Garner found strength in loyalty and stability, McQueen seemed determined to sabotage every chance at peace. Garner once described McQueen as someone who was never comfortable in his own skin. That discomfort, he believed, was McQueen's biggest problem. It didn't matter how many films he headlined or how many audiences cheered his name. Inside, McQueen was still that abandoned child, desperate to prove he was worth something. For Garner, watching this unfold wasn't just frustrating, it was heartbreaking. By the late 1970s, McQueen's fame was still strong, but the weight of his insecurities was taking its toll. Garner could see the inevitable outcome. No man could live so fiercely against himself without breaking. By the end of the 1970s, the cracks in Steve McQueen's carefully crafted image were no longer hidden. Years of paranoia, reckless choices, and strained relationships had left him weary, even as his name still carried weight in Hollywood. But nothing shook his world more than the diagnosis that arrived in 1979. Mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer linked to asbestos exposure. The revelation was devastating. For a man who had built his persona on vitality and toughness, the idea of being undone by an invisible enemy was unbearable. McQueen sought hope in unconventional treatments, traveling to Mexico to undergo unapproved procedures. Friends and colleagues described these final months as a desperate attempt to outrun the inevitable, just as he had tried to outrun his fears throughout his life. Garner, watching from afar, understood the tragedy all too well. McQueen's battle was not just with cancer, but with the lifelong inability to find peace within himself. As his body weakened, McQueen's legendary independence gave way to isolation. The rebel who once dominated the screen was now confined by illness, unable to escape the fate he had always feared, losing control. Garner, who valued dignity and authenticity, saw this as the final cruel irony. McQueen had spent decades fighting to appear stronger, cooler, and tougher than everyone else, only to face an ending that stripped all illusions away. On November 7, 1980, Steve McQueen died in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, just one day after undergoing risky surgery to remove cancerous tumors. He was only 50 years old. His death shocked the world, not just because it came too soon, but because it seemed like the final act in a life that had always been equal parts triumph and torment. For James Garner, the loss carried a complex weight. He had never shied away from criticizing McQueen's flaws, but behind those critiques was a recognition of the tragedy that defined him. Garner saw what audiences never wanted to believe. Steve McQueen's greatest enemy was never Hollywood, nor his rivals. It was himself. And in the end, that battle could not be won. In the years after Steve McQueen's death, Hollywood continued to celebrate him as the king of cool, immortalizing his image through posters, retrospectives, and endless tributes. Yet behind the glamour of that legend stood James Garner, whose perspective remained sobering and brutally honest. Garner never denied McQueen's talent. He knew firsthand how magnetic and skilled McQueen could be on screen. But he refused to romanticize the darker truths that others glossed over. To Garner, McQueen's biggest problem was clear. He could never find peace with himself. Garner contrasted sharply with his troubled co-star. While McQueen chased recognition and constantly compared himself to others, Garner built a reputation on integrity, kindness, and quiet strength. He stayed married to Lois Clark for nearly 6 decades, proving that stability and loyalty were possible in a town infamous for broken homes. Where McQueen alienated colleagues with ego, Garner was beloved by crews, directors, and fellow actors who valued his humility. Their paths showed two very different ways of navigating fame, one consumed by insecurity, the other grounded in authenticity. Over time, Garner's reflections on McQueen became more than just personal anecdotes. They were warnings about the cost of living without inner peace. He recognized that fame could magnify wounds instead of healing them, and that McQueen's inability to confront his demons had turned his success into a prison. Garner's words stripped away the myth and exposed the man beneath, brilliant but broken. Today, when audiences revisit The Great Escape or Bullitt, they see Steve McQueen at his most iconic. But to truly understand that legacy, one must also hear James Garner's voice, steady, candid, and unflinching. Garner's critique does not diminish McQueen's accomplishments. It deepens them by showing the tragedy that fueled the legend. It reminds us that even the brightest stars can burn from within, and that true greatness comes not just from talent, but from the ability to live with grace. For Garner, the final measure of a man was not how famous he became, but how he treated others and how he endured life's trials. In that measure, McQueen's story was as sad as it was unforgettable. Garner's honesty ensures that we remember both sides of the man, the hero on screen and the troubled soul behind the eyes. James Garner's words about Steve McQueen cut through the Hollywood glamour and forced us to see the man, not just the myth. It's a story of brilliance shadowed by insecurity, of fame gained but peace never found. And it leaves us with a question only you can answer. When you think of Steve McQueen, do you remember the legend on the screen, or the fragile soul behind it? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden past.